Hello, my name is Alejandro Guerrero, and today I will be doing a ToK presentation about the push to make French gender neutral. An article presented to me by my French teacher actually brought up an idea that I had never thought about, which was that of gendered versus neutral languages, and how they may have an effect on my ethical outlooks, as well as anyone who speaks a gendered language's outlooks. So, my real life situation was about a textbook published in the fall of this year, 2017, and it was written in a gender neutral version of French. So, this textbook publishing brought up a lot of tensions in the ongoing debate about the future of the French language and whether or not to make French more gender neutral and inclusive. The opinions of feminists and scholars pushing for this change are justified by their arguments of a gendered language, which promotes sexist outcomes, and shifting to a gender-neutral version would improve women's status in society. How French works, as well as Spanish for example, is that pronouns, nouns, adjectives all reflect the gender of the object to which they refer. It has no neutral grammatical gender, and oftentimes the masculine form dominates over the feminine. Like, for example, when you refer to a group of females with one male in French, you would still use a masculine pronoun for that reference. So here we can bring up the conflict of language with logic. Logically, changing a language is an extremely difficult task because that would require new knowledge to be taught, shared, and applied into every aspect the French language reaches. In the article, the ways of modifying the French language to be more inclusive were creating feminine versions of all professional nouns, like nouns relating to jobs, using neutral nouns, and adding a median period to masculine nouns, followed by a feminine ending, all which fall under inclusive writing. So how does this way of knowing affect how ethical outlooks are shaped? It may change it drastically or not at all, with other influences like culture, faith, and environment, family and friends, having a heavy influence over our ethical outlooks, arguably more than language. An analysis of my real-life situation led me to develop the question of, does language affect the shaping of ethical outlooks? My connection between my real-life situation and my knowledge question is that language allows us to communicate and function as human beings on a day-to-day basis. We absorb the languages that our parents speak from a young age, and we build on that, expanding our knowledge and ideas as we learn to express ourselves more intricately. Sharing and gaining knowledge would be nearly impossible to do as efficiently and quickly as we do in today's world if we did not have common languages, like, for example, the language I'm using in this presentation, which is why it can be argued that languages do have some degree of influence and effect over our ethical outlooks, which are what we view as right and wrong, and how that determines what we choose to learn, disregard, argue, and discuss. I myself, after reading this article and developing a knowledge question, started to realize how some of my thoughts and outlooks are different when I think in different languages, since I do speak Spanish and English fluently at home. I speak Spanish at home and English at school, and a lot of the times my thought processes are different. The way that I'll approach a situation or the way that I'll speak to my parents versus my teachers is different and sometimes similar depending on what language I'm speaking. So the areas of knowledge touched by this article are ethics and human sciences. And it uses language as the main way of knowing, but it also briefly discusses emotion, faith, and reason as other ways of knowing. So the claim that the way of knowing of language affects the area of knowing of ethics can be explained through the human sciences and how French works as a language versus English. As explained in the article, French feminists have long been campaigning with the argument that gendered languages promote sexist outlooks, and a gender-neutral language would improve women's statuses in society. The feminists argue teaching this new knowledge about a new form of French in a gender-inclusive way would promote positive changes to women in society. The article also states that scientific research has been done to suggest that gendered languages like French lead to more sexist perceptions, but these studies don't account for possibly more important factors like culture, environment, and faith. There is a theory, however, the Sapir-Whorf theory, which is basically the idea that language influences how you think. Um, Although this theory was proven incorrect in the mid-1960s, some activists continue to believe it. However, many linguists spoken to by the author of the article stress that changing a language does not guarantee a change in perception, and they argue against a change to make French more inclusive because it really wouldn't do that much change. These people often argue that outside factors like culture and faith are much more important in determining ethical outlooks. The way that the French language works is that it forces you to think in gendered terms, since you have to assign a masculine or feminine form to each noun, pronoun, and adjective. But it doesn't stop anyone from thinking of something as gender neutral. Scholars against this gender neutral change argue that knowledge gained as people grow and learn allow them to construct their ethical outlooks and influence which way they sway, much more than the French language could have an influence on that. An important aspect of how language may shape the ethical outlooks of someone starts at a young age, and a lot of this debate was centered around how this idea would be taught and introduced, starting with children. This goes back to our real-life situation about the textbook, which brought up a lot of criticism against feminists who were accused of using children as guinea pigs for their feminist agendas. The argument here would be if the language a child learns when growing up, does that shape their ethical outlooks, or would environmental influences shape their ethical outlooks? I think personally, it's a mix of both. But language as a way of knowing is learned rapidly by children, and it allows them to express and expand their knowledge as they grow. Teaching children that how they speak is affected by gender could shape their ethical outlooks as they grow up believing that one form, the masculine, is a priority over the other form, feminine, in the French language, for example, compared to a gender-neutral language like English, where no form has a particular dominance in relation to gender. However, once again, not enough evidence has been shown that a language can change ethical outlooks like this, and it is more likely that outside influences like culture, faith, and the environment of a child shapes their ethical outlooks. Even then, as we grow up and mature, our ethical outlooks change and evolve as we grow more knowledgeable about the world. Different experiences and encounters often shape what we think about people, how we view the world, and how we may approach certain situations. And this is something that language really has no influence on, other than it is a means of us to communicate how we feel and how we view those particular ideas and situations and people. In the article, those against the real-life situation of inclusive writing and a gender-neutral language argue that there are much more efficient ways to get to that point of gender equality than inclusive writing, which is partially true due to the research showing that there really isn't a way, a 100% for sure way to know that changing a language would change ethical outlooks. To summarize, language does affect our ethical outlooks, but not as much as some French feminists in our real-life situation like to believe. Apart from the research discussed in the article, not enough evidence has been shown to demonstrate a strong link between changing a language and changing ethical outlooks. But as a speaker of French, English, and Spanish, I can say that language does, as a way of knowing, have some influence over ethical outlooks, since you do have to think in gender terms in Spanish and French, but not English. Yet an issue with my conclusion is that even though language does have some influence, it's not a big one. Language is a tool that you can use to communicate your knowledge to others, and it is reflective of what you think and how much you know. That's why even if the language itself is gendered, the ideas formulated in a person's head and then expressed with that language does not have to reflect the ethical outlooks of that person. It doesn't mean that a person speaking French is automatically sexist because they use the masculine form over the feminine form. They can have different ideas brought by their different experiences and their background and their culture. It's simply the only language they know or the language they want to express themselves in that is reflective of their ideas. Thank you.